Don't hide.
We don't want to stare at ourselves, like close this, but it's live streaming already. Are you ready? All right, everybody ready? Okay, ready. I am Finley. I want to welcome you all to the Mama Galleria. I'm the director here. I just started. And Liz is my very first show of my programming of an entire year of female solo artists. And I wanted to remind everybody of a few things. Maybe turn off your phones, and because we're gonna IG live, and we're gonna have a very powerful conversation.
You are.
And I also wanted to remind everybody that there's a closing reception, which is April 16th, from 6 to 8.
We're sorry that it's Passover.
Yeah, it's Passover. But in the meantime, we also have free community Qigong with Jennifer Harmer in the space, which is really fun to do Qigong in an art space. We did it last Thursday, and we'll do it next Thursday from 6:30 to 7, maybe till 7:30, because it was so good. People were so into it. We might make it a little bit longer in an ongoing program. And then next weekend is April 9th from 2 to 3:15. I'm teaching a course where we're going to go through all of Liz's work, and then we're going to have a conversation and a skill share and a conversation around light and process and phenomena. So we have free courses, and those will stay for every solo artist. There will be a course around the work and a technical skill share. So that's coming up. And so just now let me introduce Liz. You know, I think we all know Liz. To know her is to love her. She's an artist and a light designer based in New York City. She's received her MFA in creative technologies, which I think is a really cool MFA to get for that person right there, because she's a very talented human. From Virginia Tech, and her BFA from Studio Art at Drew University, and her work has had solo shows at the Lazy Susan Gallery and 222 Bowery Art in New York City, and she's shown at museums and galleries across the country. I'm very proud of my dear friend. I think Liz is a phenomenal maker, and this is just one piece of a million different types of work that she makes. And you know, I encourage everyone to go do a studio visit, look at some of her other sculptural works, look deeper, because this is just scratching the surface. I think this is epic, but there's so much more. And for Eli, Eli Beyben is a non-binary multimodal artist, researcher, producer, and educator. And again, that's also just scratching the surface. This human being is also, like Liz, in a completely different arena: publisher, you know, designer, fantastic like organizer, artist, social practice. I mean, it just, the list goes on and on. They recently co-curated, which really the curation is a part of their social practice. So everything that they curate is also like a work of art for them. And so Move Semantics, Rules of Unfolding with Jeff Casper at EFA Project Space in New York City. Moss's projects and performances have shown at Arts Electronica and Judson Church and the Siegel Center they created Performing Knowledge Festival in Soho 2020, Dixon Place, and the Exponential Festival, among others. They are a professor at Pratt Institute and the founder and creative director of the Operating System and Liminal Lab, and are published widely. And so I want to remind everybody that Liz's book is coming out, which Eli organized, which I think there will be a conversation around that. But we're really excited about the catalog, and without further ado, my dearest.
Thank you so much, Finley. We did not plan our outfits.
Liz also happened at the opening with our so I'm really excited to be having this conversation today. You know, as Finley said, even being in the gallery and looking at this work is only scratching the surface for understanding what's going on in Liz's practice. And to have the opportunity to talk about sort of what we were thinking about curating this show, putting this show together is just really exciting. And I'm someone who is really dedicated to the archive as well, and to sort of the long hand of art, right? So what it means to publish has for me to do with kind of like ownership around telling our own story as artists and creative people and putting things in an archival form. It's sort of a gallery that will forever be there, right? So one thing that I just want to do, I do a lot of events, and so part of my practice is always doing event acknowledgement, so I'm just going to do that really quickly. I just want to acknowledge that La Mama Galleria, as well as the operating system and the Middle Lab, and Liz and Molly's practice is on the unceded land of the Lenape and Munsee people. And they are the traditional stewards of this land. So just wanted to acknowledge that. Okay. Do you want to say a few words before we go on this one?
I think I'm going to be saying many words
You
for
are.
a while, so I'll save my words.
All right. So the first thing I just wanted to start with is the name.
Oh, wait, I do want to say something.
There you go.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes.
Thank you for tuning in if you're watching, and I'm very grateful for that. I almost forgot to say that. Okay, please.
I thought you might want to say that. Actually, in the realm of thanks, we are live streaming to Instagram via the La Mama Galleria IG. Hi, people at home. We're also archiving on the operating system and Liminal Lab, YouTube, so these things will be available later. As an access note, there are captions and will be a live transcript as well. So for anyone who wants to look at these later and wants to go a little deeper into the text, there'll be full notes for anyone for whom that is helpful. I also just think we should just thank our gallery staff, thanks to Finley, thanks to everybody who helped us hang this show. It was a beast. So everyone who was involved, thank you. Seeing the people sitting in the gallery, cleaning the gallery, right? Everybody gets not necessarily shown. Okay. Yes, they're really important. This gallery really needs to be cleaned all the time.
I know, I cleaned it myself.
I know, me too. All right, so I wanted to start out just with sort of the name of the show, Sleight of Hand. I wanted to call this talk of Hand.
I did say no.
I'm really corny, but so the reason I wanted to start with the name Sleight of Hand is, what do you want to call it? This lecture, I wanted to call this conversation Talk to the Hand, because the show was Sleight of Hand. I thought that was so funny. Yeah. So I now just get to say it out loud. So anyway, Sleight of Hand. So the where that came from is I was thinking about like, well, what do we want to call this show? And I was like, there is really magic in this work. But to call it magic is to sort of not really acknowledge or not really know how much physicality, how much of Liz is here and how much of Liz's hand is here, right? And so in choosing the pieces together and working with what was going to go on the wall, so much of what we were really thinking about is sort of like what doesn't necessarily get seen. And for me as a curator, as someone who's had the opportunity to be in the studio with Liz and kind of see what's happening there, I was like, what's really important for me is gesture and touch and sort of the physicality and really like a somatic practice, right? And so in a lot of the work that you see in this room, you're seeing both this technical prowess, this unbelievable technical prowess, but you're also seeing something very tactile and sometimes pieces that almost look like illustration, right? Like there's some here and then in the gallery wall. Something that was really important for us and that we ended up working with for this show was showing the giant range of scale. Right, you've got these tiny pieces in the back, you've got these little text prints, and you also have, tools that Liz uses in the practice, right? And so something that I think we discussed and that ended up really coming forward. Now, Liz already was working with the amazing people, tell us their names again, who made the videos.
Eric Michael Pearson and Liz Damon.
Eric Michael Pearson and Liz Damon made these incredible videos, which if you haven't seen, hopefully you'll have the opportunity to see. And I think that it's always scary as an artist, to be like, oh, I'm gonna show what's happening behind the scenes. Can I do that? Right? We're kind of taught that that's not a thing you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to let people in, right? And that goes hand in hand with sort of the idea that the value behind art is its scarcity, right? That you can only make one of these, and that the reason that it's important is because no one can have it but you. I want to say that that's not the reason that Liz's work is important, or that work is important in general, right? And so showing what's behind the scenes and not only saying, I'm going to show you this, but that this is an invitation. This is a way that we're inviting you in to something that Liz has been able to conjure and be in relationship to, that is in our world all the time, right? And the reason why it's important to pay for art is because of what art allows us to do, not because it's scarce, not because no one else can have it, right? It's because art says, oh, you didn't even realize that you're around light all the time. And so Liz is there in between light and you being like, guess what? Your world is this. People have come into the show and been like, these are very powerful. Like, I feel them in my body. And it's like, yes, because they're all around me, right? And so that's why they're here. You know, it's the magic that Liz has been able to conjure. Anyway, so, hi, Dawn. So Liz is going to tell us a little bit, just first, in case you haven't seen the videos, about kind of what the electromagnetogram process actually is. And then we're going to get a little deeper into what it means for Liz to know those technical things, but then go back in and be a person and a hand and, you know, do something that I think art always is, which is like what Donna Haraway calls like symbiosis, making with. It's you and a material. It's you in a relationship with the material, right? It's not just you, but it is also you. Tell us about electromagnetogram.
Well, I got very lazy sitting here talking to you, just listening to you. I'm like, oh, now I have to explain what this process is. The process. Well, there's a lot to the process, but simply, and to break down it's quite a mouthful, electromagnetogram. And what it is it's all made with a laser and prisms. And a laser is a single frequency of light, so light amplification of stimulated electromagnetic radiation.
So monogram, did you know?
So yeah, the naming it's named after the fact that I use a laser, and a gram is in photography, the naming convention. You have luminograms and chemograms, and these are also part chemogram too, and part luminogram. I mean, anyway, so I how do I make these things? Well, the way the small ones are made are very different than the large pieces, but generally speaking, and do I do the demo now?
You can. I mean, so we're going to have a little demo for you so that we're actually showing you what we're going to talk about. We're going to do a little switch here.
So this will just make, this is like, I have less words. I could use less words and more show and tell. So this is basically, here's my tool. This green laser pointer basically makes all of this work. And so now, how do I, as you can see in the work, there's lots of different textures and strokes and saturations and widths. And so it all started with this prism, these prisms right here, a friend gave me, and I was working at a club called Love, and the owner gave me a laser pointer just like this. And I was just like, oh, this is cute, thanks. What am I going to do with this thing? And then my friend Condra gave me these beautiful antique prisms, and I was home and just sort of futzing around, and I put them together, and I realized that they did this kind of cool little magical thing here. And so I was operating a very expensive lighting setup, a couple $100,000 worth of lighting equipment in a nightclub. And it was it was a small room. And so I put these little prisms out in front of, on top of my lighting console. And I took my little laser pointer, and I'd be operating the lights, and you know, it's like you're syncing the lights to the music and you're creating an environment. And then I would whip out my little laser pointer at an opportune moment and create what I thought was a peak experience. I think so. People kind of went like bananas when the laser pointers came out. And then I was just like, oh, I need another one of these things. So I got 2 laser pointers. And then there I was going like, you know, like, look at it, you know. And with the little haze, you really get an effect. So it sort of looked like I had some really high-tech, expensive equipment, but really it was like $15 light show. You know, I was like using that over the lights. So anyway, that was there, and you know, I spent a lot of years as a commercial photographer doing editorial photography and art photography, and spent lots of time in dark rooms. And wow, look, there's my professor from college right there, who showed me, who I took my first alt photo class with.
Thank you so much.
Coming. And so all of this, you know, knowledge is just in my head, and I was living in Virginia with Jessie Mann and her mom, Sally Mann, the famous photographer, had these bonfire prints. So basically prints that were not going to go to use and she was going to burn. And there's a guy named Ray Cass. He's an artist, an old-time New York artist, and he does something called the Mountain Light Workshop. And he was really interested in Jessie and I and Sally coming together and collaborating. And so Jessie and I sort of did a lot of, you know, thinking about how we could collaborate. Jessie is a painter. And we sort of came up with this thing where Jessie would take Fixer, which is the third chemical, oh my gosh, in the process. And when you apply it to the paper first, it leaves a negative space. And so Jessie would start and she'd throw some, you know, Fixer down, and I would watch what she was doing in the dark, and then I would do a sort of light gesture that I thought would complement what she had done, and then we'd expose it. We made about 40 of those prints together, and some of them are actually still on tour in museums down south. And then we didn't make them for many years. And then when I moved back, I always wanted to make them alone. Actually, I had a very strong feeling like I just need to make these alone. So when I moved back to New York after graduate school in 2017, I started converting. I still had my studio space of 18 years, and I started converting it into a dark room with the intention of making these pieces. And so I did. And I've been making these pieces alone since 2018. That's a lot of talking and a lot of history. So now I'm just going to sort of show you some fun things. Here are like lots of little ways that I've figured out how to break the light up and get all of these different textures. So there are these cool things. This is called diffraction grading, and it's used in photography. I'm a little bit of a, you know, I know dorky science things, but the cool thing is if you take this, it multiplies the beam. Now, if you fold it over, it multiplies the beam more. And so now we have like sort of infinite ways to break the beam up. Now, if you take these same little things and you kind of cut them very carefully and you put them in a little, you can get these little pieces and you can stick them in here. Then you can start doing things like that. Or, so if you line them up differently, you get different effects. So that's one way of breaking up the beam, or two ways.
And then you'll see some of these, like some of this language is part of the naming convention for the pieces. So if you look at the catalog list for the show, someone will be called diffraction grading, right? Or sometimes.
And if you have any like random questions, just shout them out. I like the informality of this. Now, the other cool thing is just like, here's just I've cannibalized a bunch of different projectors and different optics from wherever I see a piece of glass or something that I'm like, ooh, you know, here's this little weird thing that like, how does the light go through that? So, you know, laser beam, it's consistent. So no matter how far away you are, you get that dot. And so that's why it's really different to make a big piece versus a small piece, because it's not scalable. So you have to figure out, well, how do I get this like little detail big? And so but it's, if you just start even with a broken glass, let's see, you start to get, and it's just really about like looking and seeing what things do. So this makes the beam a little bigger. It's really hard to control, but then when you kind of go through these lasers, then you start getting shadows. And if you put the lasers, I don't know if everyone can see the floor, but so these are prism arrays I started building when I was doing the nightclub thing. If you can,
Feel free to stand if you need to.
you'll get a better sense of the patterns that this is capable of making, especially when you start putting the lasers in more of a, the prisms more of a circle. So then when you make the beam a little fatter, you get, it's just infinite. There's so many different things you can do. So it's, painting with light essentially. But then there's the chemical process that you can add into this. And then suddenly you have, you just have all these different languages, these beautiful patterns. I could just do this all day. All day.
So if you haven't been in there yet, at the front of the gallery is actually a room that we designed and constructed. Well, I didn't personally construct it, but we designed it, in which you can see the types of patterns that play on the wall, more in a dark environment, which of course we're all sitting here in the light. But if you can imagine in the studio, this is not happening in the light, this is happening under red studio lighting, right? And so in that room, you get a little bit of a chance to see sort of a mock of what's happening for Liz in the studio, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about like doing those projections before making a piece?
Okay, so sure, I will. So when you start to get to this size, suddenly, well, this paper, the paper is basically the price of silver.
Yeah.
So it's not a cheap process to do, and it's so big and it's so physical. And to make pieces this size, I actually had to construct. I had troughs built that are in the back. Actually, yeah, they're used after the talk. You can go back and take a look at them, but they're used as display cases. But that's what I use to roll the paper through the chemistry. And I also had a large tray made so I can solarize the print. And that's another technique I use where I'm exposing the paper again repeatedly. So it's not just one exposure, but it's many. So the initial exposure is made, and for something this large, I've come up with a giant shutter system where I use backdrop rolls, and I've attached a long wooden dowel and lots of little metal discs, and then I use high-powered magnets, and I put the paper up all in the dark. I hoist the paper up, and then I lower the two pieces of paper in front of it. Before I do any of that, though, I have elaborate setups of lasers on boom arms with lots of little pieces of glass, and everything is just kind of just right. And I sort of preconceive the painting or the basic premise of what the light painting is going to be.
Do you want to do more demo?
I think if there are questions, I'd love to.
So are your shapes predetermined? Are your shapes predetermined, or is there a lot of like experimentation and happy accidents?
Well, I mean, yeah, both, but I think that at this point, the control comes in. There's a sense of, I have a sense of control. I've been experimenting long enough where I know what I'm going to get, and so it's really, so with a big piece like this, there is a good portion of it is sort of pre-planned, or as pre-planned as it can be. But then there's a lot of room for chance, but also there's,
For instance,
chance.
like what you're seeing on the edges of that piece.
Well, yeah, we can get to that. But so mostly with this piece, so the first exposure will happen, and then I look at the piece and I stop and I'm like, well, what does this need? How, it's not singing yet. It's how do I make this sing? Like, what is it? So then it becomes very painterly, and I'm looking at it as weight, saturation, stroke, you know, what makes the composition successful? You know, all these things, and also what makes a composition successful from a close distance and from a far away distance. And so it sort of has to meet both of those criteria for me. And so as you, like in this case, am I talking too much now?
No, but we're not really in conversation, it's fine. But I know, I sent all the questions to you this morning, so you're answering them without me actually saying.
Oh, well, I'm gonna say one more thing, and then so it's just
Keep
like.
going, it's very interesting.
So I, like, for example, there's my foot mark, and that's for me standing on it and making a stroke over it and sort of adding to the piece. It becomes an additive process. So that's in, you know, and then there's also the chemistry part of the electromagnetic front, but I'm sure the questions will. What happened?
The chemistry, can you talk a little more about that? Like, does that, you have to wear a special glove when it hits your body?
I mean, I walk in these barefoot, like, these are my footprints are
Not
all,
necessarily because you should.
well, nobody's ever
You
died.
could be naked and.
Nobody's ever died from black and white photography chemicals. Like, I think they've all lived to be very old, to an old age. So I'm not, I mean, I don't eat in the dark room, but I don't touch my face or my mouth, but I do use bare hands. And, barefoot, apparently.
So what's like first, second, and third, like, is there a background, middle ground, foreground? Like, how do you build up the shapes? Like, for example, what was the first thing that you did on that?
The first thing on this piece was these big movements here, these arcs, yeah.
And what were those made like? That paper thing that you had?
Those were made using a antique glass dish.
Okay. And then when did you put that like swoosh in there that has little ripples?
That was just like after the fact. So once that initial exposure happened, then I went and I took the developer and I painted on. And I start to bring in and reveal what the light has left on the surface of the paper. And as it's coming in, I'm making decisions on the fly. It's just like, if something is starting to get too dark, I may throw a little stop back on it and stop that from happening. Or I'll put it in the developer and then I start adding onto it and building the composition.
So that's like the chemistry of the browns and the like that kind of like puddle.
The browns in this case are from a process called chromoscedasic Sabatier, which is a mouthful. And it's two extra chemicals that you add, and it smells a lot like ammonia, and that will probably give me cancer maybe, but hopefully it won't. But yeah, that with this matte paper gives it this sort of rusty tone, and you can see it again in the London.
And then what did you use for the next? Like what tool?
The middle.
Yeah.
So that's when I use the diffraction grating, that little clear piece of film that breaks up the laser beam.
Okay.
That's what it is. So it's a laser going through a sort of series of those diffraction gratings.
So, yeah, so I think like one of the things that I want to make sure that we talked about, especially after doing the technical demo, it's really easy for the conversation about Liz's work to become like, what are all the technical things? My God, it's so technically interesting, right? And so one of the questions that I sort of asked Liz ahead of time, and also that I wanted for us to talk about today is sort of like, what do you think people wouldn't see in your work that you want to make sure that they realize is part of your process or that you're thinking about as you're working?
Well, I mean, a lot goes into the work. And so, I mean, they might not see my footprints. I mean, there's like, every time I walk up to this piece, I'm like, oh yeah, there's another footprint. But you don't really see how it's made. And even if you do have a background in photography, I think that there's a bit of a mystery to the piece. At least that's what I try to maintain while I'm making it. I don't want it to, I don't want it to be too obvious, but I still want there to be, a sign that it was handmade by an artist, because for example, that's why I paint on the developer. It's really important for me. I think in the pieces, you can see like this one, actually I processed in a tray. But this one, the developer was painted on, and I think it's really important, because if you step up to this piece to sort of go back to it, even if you have a background in photography, or if you don't, or you're just like, how is this made? You might think it's a digital print, or you might think it was made in a computer. And so that's why it feels really important for me to sort of leave the mark of the chemistry and leave the mark of my hand, so that it kind of gives you a little bit of a clue, the viewer a clue of the process.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, the idea of whether or not there can be a plan, right? So yes, but never, right? I think like call and response, the way that I've sort of talked about this work before, like there is a relationship between sort of like, I'm learning how to use these technical things, I'm seeing what it is that I can do. And then when I'm there, I also realize you want to expose these other things, and you allow yourself to be adaptive and responsive, which I think is very beautiful.
Yeah, it kind of all goes along with this, I love problem solving, and this work for me is sort of solving visual problems, right? How do you make this piece sing? You only have black and white, or maybe some tonality. And so how do you make something that's black and white sing? How do you make it feel like, it grabs you?
I was really glad that Finley said before, because it was something that I wanted to talk about today, that Liz is not only a photographer. When you make work and you get known for a particular thing, it's really hard to, again, retain your story and not be like, you'll be like, oh, Liz Ligoria, photographer. And then you're like, oh, I mean, that's part of my practice that I'm doing when I'm using this sort of thing, but I'm also not using a camera. I'm doing this work in the darkroom. That's a really limiting word, right? So something I wanted Liz to talk a little about today is like how this practice, this particular darkroom practice, is in conversation with what you're doing in other mediums and the questions that you've asked in other mediums.
Well, it does go back to that problem solving and process, and and also just making beautiful things, or trying to make beautiful things. So having a background in lighting design, photography, these are all little bits in my head. But then I'll work with ceramic, and I'll work with 3D prints that then become a porcelain sculpture, or I went down a rabbit hole on number 2 pencils, and sort of kind of why you've gotten a pencil that says chemical dependency issues is just because I have a thing for number 2 pencils, and I know a lot about number 2 pencils now. I made sculptures with them, but it's really about, there are a couple of things you could distill it down to, is how far can I explore something and push it? And then I do have this sort of fetish for analog, like low tech and high tech, and the connection between those two, and sort of bringing them together.
I have a friend who's an art writer, a colleague of mine, and he came and saw Liz's show, and we were walking around talking about it, and said, so interesting that Liz has chosen to like make abstraction right now, and everything's representative. And I was like, I'm not sure that I think about this show as abstraction. Like it is, yes, but I think something that Liz is also doing is sort of actually exposing. I can't with the puns. I literally can't. They just come out. But exposing what's in our environment, right? And so I guess I'd like you to talk just a little bit about sort of like what you feel like you learned or are learning, like in this relationship, like with light, which I think you talked about a little bit in terms of the club, but sort of how has it been profound? Because I do think it has been profound.
Yeah, I have these moments, like there are some pieces, there are 2 pieces on the wall right when you come in that are part of the Meta Cloud series, and there's some more on the wall over here. And if you look at that, they look a little bit like, they look like clouds. And the reason why I call them Meta Clouds is for that, but also I made them by taking little droplets of water and a syringe and putting them on the underside of the glass. And then when you take See, I've also come up with different ways to modify the laser, so instead of having a point, I can have a line like this. And you'll see that a lot in the strokes. It just gives me a different way to, you know, it's sort of like having different paint brushes and different ways to paint. And so if I hit that little droplet of water from a very particular angle from the above side, I get something that looks like clouds. And I just thought this was like fascinating, because what are clouds but a bunch of little particles of water with light going through them? And so hence the name metaclouds. But I just, you know, when you discover these little connections, or at least for me, it just keeps me going down that path. And I think there's so much to this work that I could explore. I could make this work for the rest of my life. And I think I'll always find something new, because just with, even if you just took these variables, like the things I've showed you, those prisms, that diffraction grating, a couple of lenses, you have infinite possibilities of what you can do. And so just discovering, as I've made this work, I just kind of, I discover something, I sort of add it to my toolbox of you know, ways to express light and bend it.
I think that's part of why curatorially, and I was glad that Liz was willing to let me do this, our direction for the show ended up being very maximal. You know, I remember people coming at the beginning and family being like, this is not a small show. Well, guess what? This is not small work. This is infinite work. Like, there's literally in every single piece, there's like infinite numbers of pieces that can be discovered. And so the direction of the curation was also to be like, this is maximal. This is just scratching the surface, even of what Liz is capable of. And the range of what you're seeing of the marks, right, and of the style is a nod to how expansive this practice is for Liz, right? And just like those little test pieces, I mean, for me, I could show everything in the studio, and even if it's a mistake, and the reason is because it's still a learning process, right? I mean, I don't know how many people in the audience are artists, but like in our best moments, we're just having joy and discovery, right? Like, and we're having this excitement, and so there's joy here, right? I'm gonna give them out.
I thought this would be kind of fun. I actually happen to have some test pieces in this box that I wasn't planning on doing this, but I think that might be fun to pass them around, just so you can, I don't know, tactile touch.
And they have
Can they have them? Maybe we can do a pop quiz.
What is Cobus and Debate Sebastian? I think
If you can even say that word, I've got a print.
Okay. Are there stories about particular pieces in the show, either in their creation or other ways that you want to share?
Stories of pieces in the show. Yes, well, this piece right here. There's a funny story. I know, there's a funny story to this piece. I actually had two friends of mine in the studio with me that day, and I just started making these large works the end of this past year, because I figured out how to make the trough, and so I'm just starting to scratch the surface of this large work. I'm really excited to just keep making it, just going big. So it's a lot of work to, you know, see the paper together, and so I'm deep in this piece right here, and it's laid out on about, I don't know, 12 folding tables. I now own more folding tables than any human in New York, maybe, I don't know. You know, I have like 13 folding tables. And so this thing is laid out and it's seamed together, and I had made both of these exposures, and then I just, you know, I started developing it. I'm like, oh God, I'm really into this. It's like looking great. And my friend Justin was in there, and he was like, oh, I should play some, like, you know, can I play a song? I was like, sure, just go on Bluetooth and play a song. And so, you know, he didn't ask me which Bluetooth to select, but there was an ITV an Apple TV set up to a TV that was in the room, and he selected entertainment center, which turned the TV on. So there, all of a sudden, Justin is just like, and then Krista, like a football linebacker, like went and like tackled the TV, and then Justin was like pulling out the plugs from the TV because, you know, it's getting exposed by the light from the television. Hello, come in. Come sit down. And so there we all are freaking out in the dark room, in the dark, scattering around, like trying to figure out, finally unplug the TV, and, you know, there, that whole top bit wound up getting solarized, creating that sort of gray border on top. And poor Justin, I mean, he was really ready to off himself. He was just like having a nervous breakdown that he had ruined something. And I was just like, you know what, this is part of, you know, when you make this work, you embrace these chance happenings. And this was that. And I think in this case, it worked. It didn't take away. I sort of figured out actually that, you know, oh, this needs to be on top, and, you know, so I was able to keep that. Of course, I could crop that out if I wanted to, but, you know, I made a decision to keep it because I thought that it still worked. But anyway, that would not be immediately apparent, especially, and Justin was like literally, I mean, he had to see a therapist.
But then he helped us hang the show and was like so pleased that this accident that we had a hand in making, you know, was here. And you know, I mean, in some of the other pieces that we chose, there's a piece and funny. There were two pieces of this that were framed, and they were framed with the glass on backwards, and so they became also exposed in a different way, kind of took out a bluish tone, and we ended up. You want to tell? It was museum glass, and it was, you have to put museum glass. It has an anti-glare, and so if you know, it's very specific. It has to go on one side, but the frame, it was like frame the show overnight, and so. You know, they framed it overnight basically, and they put it on, you know, two pieces backwards, and it off gassed and turned the print blue. Which is kind of beautiful.
Well, no, it's just like, actually, I was devastated. It's actually,
Up next to the meta cloud,
They're-
1, 2, 3.
they're not blue anymore. I took them out of the frame and I let them have some air, and they went back to the normal color, but it's the piece on the bottom right there that has those little like U-shaped sideways U's, and then the piece up at the top that has the sort of lines that looks like, those pieces had turned completely blue. They look like cyanotypes. And they didn't, one worked and one didn't. But anyway, yeah, so.
But so, you know, when we were putting together the show, that piece was still blue. It got less blue over the course of the last couple of months. And, you know, it's been a really interesting thing to be in conversation with you about this stuff, because, you know, at a certain point we were going to hang it, even though it was blue, right? And part of that conversation was that, you know, even, this is very, you know, Duchamp straddling glass, right? Even along the way, not necessarily things you're personally doing, but that kind of,
But it has to work.
it doesn't, yes.
It has to work.
Yes. But this is that kind of, this is kind of the artist as a part of nature, right? Like, there's all these things, not all of the acorns become a tree, right? Like, there's all these things happening, and it's this sort of expansive, maximal willingness to continue answering, you know, asking and answering questions and kind of learning from what's happening. And, you know, we even had a little adventure in the prison room where things were, you know, and we were, you know, and it's been kind of this like learning adaptation.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
In regards to, I'm only contrasting to like painting, because it's easy for me in a way, like a painter could always add more paint, take a break, add more paint. Can you adjust, can you tweak, can you modify over time? You're like, you know, this needs more XYZ.
I can only add. I can't take away. And so that's why, you know, there is a sort of, you can go too far. you can definitely go too far. And I've gotten good at not going too far, you know. Picasso famously said art is knowing when to draw the line. Yeah, you could, because you could definitely add, or sometimes it's just like, you know, you're in a running attitude, it's just like, well, now I might as well just like, you know, do everything to it and see what happens, but yeah, you can't take away.
But of these, you can revisit and add.
You can't revisit, once it goes through all the chemical processes, that's it, it's done. You fix it. Fixing it is one of the last chemical steps, but that fixes it so it's light safe. So you can turn, you know, turn on lights and it's gonna kind of be stable in that condition. You can, you know, I basically add into it until I feel like it's ready, and then I put it through the stop bath and the fixer.
Something that I wanted to ask, you know, pieces this large, working on them in the studio is a very different experience from actually seeing them someplace like this, because although the studio is large, it's not really possible to put it on a wall this big and walk all the way over there, right? So one of the questions that I had for you had to do with sort of like how having this show hum change your experience of the work.
This has been an amazing gift. I mean, the best gift that I have, I mean, getting to put this work, I mean, I have my studio has high ceilings, it's about 900 square feet, but there's really no room to put a piece up and sort of just let it breathe and have space and sit and take it in. And so getting to put this work up on the walls and all of it in this room and just being able to see all of these different things that I've made over time in one space has been one of the greatest gifts. And, you know, I just want to thank Finley for, you know, having me one of the artists that he's showcasing, because it's really, it has been magic for me. And it's informed my work. And it's really going to inform how I begin to make my next pieces.
Did you learn anything about any of the pieces in particular about seeing them this way?
I learned how many damn footprints, how many of my feet are in this piece.
So many.
I really, you know, I really didn't, I mean, I didn't notice that. You know, every time I walk up to it, I'm like, I noticed something new, but I also noticed, oh, you know, I want to try this, or, you know, I'm kind of like thinking ahead of how I might do something differently.
Well, let's talk about the book. So something that Liz and I talk about a lot, because I do this, right, is what it means to talk about yourself. Here we are doing it, but what it means to put yourself in language and what it means to like think about sort of, you know, naming yourself and putting yourself in words for other people to see. So how are you feeling? What are you thinking about, you know, the process of putting a book together? How has that been for you? And how has it been to work with writing? Because this is also one of the fellows, sort of the cohort members in this year-long experiment, an interdisciplinary experiment that the operating system is doing this year. So it's artists from across many disciplines, and everyone is taking field notes on their practice or on their daily life. And so Liz has been working with writing. And I think for a lot of artists, this could be really an area of difficulty. So talk a little bit about what's happening with you with writing.
Well, you know, I've gone into a practice of doing the morning pages, basically, just sort of brain dump in the morning and just wake up and I make my coffee and then I sit down and I just empty my brain out. Whatever comes, I'm not worried about it being, I'm not worried about anyone else reading it. I should be maybe, but. And that's helpful, and it's made me want to write more. And, you know, I've also been doing the field notes, as Eli mentioned, and that's sort of been notes about things in my life that contribute to the process and contribute to being an artist. And you know, sort of keeping things I do to keep my creativity or keep myself engaged in art. That's not the best answer, but.
Words, they're really imperfect. No, so I think one of the questions that I wanted to talk about was sort of, you know, something that's a real struggle with this is work, you know, and as we've been on Instagram trying to talk about the show, I feel like I can say, please come see it live, like if you can, because scale, right? So, let's talk a little bit about, because I know that you have a web presence and you also, you know, website, like, this is actually pretty challenging work to document in a certain way, because the scale of it, when seen on the screen or when seen on the page, you know, if you're not actually seeing scale figures, right? I work with architects and I have an architecture background, and I often be like, you really need to put a scale figure in here, Joni, where, my architecture. Anyway, but you know, you're not able to see the scale, right? So for Liz, this is a challenge, right? Documenting this work and putting it on a page, on the screen, on a website, often really changes this work in a way. And so this is a challenge that we're dealing with and putting it in.
Yeah, just shooting photos of the large scale pieces is, you know, I mean, it's an art form. Copy photo, taking copy photos is a whole art form in and of itself. Lighting it and, but also being able, you know, the thing about, it doesn't translate in, like on the web or in 2D. You really, there's so much detail that's happening. And I think, you know, like most artwork, you really need to sort of get up on it and then move back away from it. And you can't do that on a website or, you know, on the web. I mean, you sort of can like zoom in. It's just not the same experience as being, you know, in the same room with the artwork. So it's a little frustrating that it doesn't translate, but I've been experimenting with taking videos of the artwork where you sort of like, you know, you have a wide view and then you sort of pan in and you fly over it. And, you know, so I think I'm going to incorporate that into my website just as a way to sort of play with this idea that it doesn't translate. So it's sort of, you know, it's kind of like lending itself to making a new art form.
It is. I mean, and it's a question of the archive, right? If more people over time will relate to the work in other forms, most people who see this work will not see it here, right? We'll see it on the page, we'll see it on the website, we'll see it on Instagram, right? We'll not actually physically be able to be here. And for work like this, it begs the question, how do we document work like this, right? And some of it is language. How do we talk about it so that someone interacting with it understands what it is that is maybe not describable in documentation and photo documentation, right? So that's been, I think, a challenge that we've been.
We're approaching it now.
Totally. Should we ask the nice people if they have any questions?
I think so.
Hi, nice people.
Yeah, are there any questions about process, maybe seeing laser things, or I don't know? Yes,
Are you the only person doing this?
yes, it's an invented process and nothing really looks like it because I just, you know, made up. So as of now, I'm the only person I know who's doing it. Yeah.
What song is Justin trying to play?
He was trying to play a David Bowie song.
Really? Which one?
Oh, God, I don't remember.
That tracks.
Which one?
No, I said that tracks.
Oh, yeah. I love that question.
Can we talk a little more about, because you have a background in music and you're DJing, and like, what do you listen to in the studio, and does it vary, or how does that kind of influence? I see, especially the larger format stuff, it's almost choreographic, it's almost dance-like, you know, there's a lot of movement involved, and just kind of figure what you're listening to.
You know, this might shock you, but I love working in complete silence. I do work with music. It would be, you know, I'd be lying if I said I didn't work to music, and it's usually something that, you know, I feel with my body and I could dance to. But sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes there's this band called After Clank that it's just like it's just obsessed to for a while. But yeah, it really, you know, my musical tastes are broad and cover lots of different territories, but sometimes I just literally work in silence. Often, actually. Talk about the frequency. Yeah, so I'm building a sculpture that is taken from this process of, I just sort of had this large speaker and I was just like, oh, I want to vibrate the surface of the water. I want to change the frequency of the surface of the water. So I think I started off with a speaker under a giant 30 by 40 tray. So that size, yeah, 30 by 40s. And, it had water in it. And I think actually NPR was playing. I think it was like somebody's voice and it was just like changing the surface tension of the water. And so when you run the laser across the surface, you wind up getting a frequency that reflects back. It translates into a frequency. So there's a piece of that last piece closest to the door.
On the 30 by 40 wall right behind it.
That's actually a piece made with music. So there's music playing under the tray of water. And then that is a record of those frequencies. And so the sculpture that I'm making, I think it will be lucite, but it'll have inducers built into the bottom of the tray so that I can invite a musician to come and collaborate with me and plug into this giant tray of water and change the surface tension of the water with their frequency, actually, and then the electromagnetogram, big word, electromagnetogram would be a record of the collaboration.
So, right, I think you might want to be like, oh, like this work is not necessarily cohesive, but I think maybe in your body, you do feel like it's cohesive, even though it's very different. And the cohesion, right, is that it's always light and there's always experimentation, right? There's discovery throughout this process of discovery and relationship to these non-human, always present forces. Okay. Any other questions? There was someone over here. No?
I have a question, but I don't quite know how to ask it. In photography, right, your blacks are the absence of light when you expose the paper, right? To the negative,
Opposite.
right, like
With a
where there's
If
more
you're working
light.
on a negative,
Yeah, so how does it work in yours? Like, are the brightest areas?
okay, this is a great question. So there are two different types of paper in the show. Actually, there are a bunch of different types of paper, but there's something that's like this, and this is if you use a negative, right, which is the negative of the image. But I'm not using a negative. So light in this is black. There's another paper on that wall or in those little handouts that I give everyone. That's a direct positive paper. And that's the sort of paper that you would use if you were using one of these antique cameras, like an 8x10, you would put the paper directly in the back of the camera and then make an exposure and it would capture the landscape exactly as it is. And so in that case, the light is white.
Okay.
Now, a thing I figured out with this process, so there are the smallest pieces over there, you can see that there's white strokes and black strokes. And so with the direct positive paper, I'm able to get the white strokes are the initial exposure. But then once it's in the chemistry and I expose it, it solarizes the paper and I get black strokes as well. So it's a really, another thing to experiment with. And I love using that paper, but the one thing I don't like about that paper is that it only comes in glossy. And it's a fiber-based paper. So it's really, this is also fiber-based paper, but it's not, I really like the sort of matte finish. And glossy makes it a little difficult, but you kind of figure out ways to make it work.
So that paper gives you a blacker black than this paper, right? You know what I mean?
It does give you a sort of blacker black because of the glossiness in a way.
That was a great question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
We appreciate you.
Anything else? All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, please.
Not making fun. like, if you took a bunch of lasers and a bunch of cats and you let them like scratch around, like, is that what you would see? Like the way you do your feet? Could that happen? I told you.
I mean, I'm just sort of visualizing the spectacle of cats and lasers, and I can't get past that.
Well, you're not saying you play with cats and lasers.
Oh, I see, like,
Like,
how
you
the
get them
cats
going,
chase the lasers.
chase the lasers and say they went into the chemicals when you
I
get
mean,
them.
you might wind up with a bunch of catos, cato shadows. Cat shadows, shadow cats, I mean, either way,
You would have a total.
and that's a new naming convention. Bring on the cats.
Yeah,
I'm allergic.
I'm too.
I'm allergic.
Or put them in the chemicals and throw it.
Oh my goodness. All right,
Thank
thank you
you
all
so
so
much.
much.
Thank you.